Patrols, shadow fleets, and silent subs, enforcement by other means. While the lawyers debated bathymetry, cutters and corvettes drew their own lines. A boarding party stepping from a grey hull to a darker one looked like routine safety. On the manifest, it was taxation. Papers please, logbook open, cargo list checked against permits that referenced coordinates most crews couldn't pronounce. The message was simple: if you sail this lane, you pay the keeper, whether the treaty is finished or not. Stakes were immediate for anyone moving cargo or catching fish. A hold full of cod could turn into a fine if a waypoint strayed over a claimed boundary. An LNG carrier could lose a day and a market window if an escort demanded a compliance check. For communities along the coast, a cutter at the horizon meant medevac on a good day and pressure on a bad one. Presence wears a polite face until it needs teeth. Here's what actually happened. Coast Guards became revenue protection with search and rescue branding. A white and red hull paced a conv, then peeled off to board a bulker that lagged behind. Inspectors checked ice class certificates and fuel logs, then hinted at routing advice that sounded a lot like orders. For safety, the officer said, redirecting a ship toward a channel where escorts were for sale. The invoice arrived later, clean as a boarding ladder. Known to them across the night, another fleet sailed without names. Shadow tankers with fresh paint and old scars drifted into polar twilight as AIS dots winked out. Call it darkness or deniability, either way the traffic didn't stop when the screens went blank. Crews learned to run quiet, low lights, tight convoys, and a tolerance for silence that made insurers sweat. These ships showed up where sanctions and schedules collided, moving cargoes that needed to arrive and couldn't be seen arriving. Micro story: a chief mate on a reflagged product tanker watched their transponder fail in a snow squall. 30 minutes later, a second hull slid into formation, barely visible against the flow edge. They matched speed by instinct and nerve, rode the ridgeline of a radar return, and parted 2 hours later with a whistle nobody on shore would hear. Weeks after, the invoice hit an account routed through 3 shells and 1 brass plate in a city without sea. Meanwhile, submarines wrote the part of the map nobody will publish. Under the pack, silent hulls traced cables and surveyed seabeds for the kind of detail that turns legal theory into tactical certainty. Crews counted seconds between pings and measured the slope of a ridge with sonar like a blind hand on a staircase. They laid small things you won't see on a satellite: acoustic nodes, distributed sensors, and markers that told a captain in a language of echoes where a keel could pass and where it would die. There was one problem surface fleets couldn't solve: awareness without daylight. So drones and satellites took the watch. Synthetic aperture radar spotted wakes under clouds. Infrared teased out engine heat against water that eats it. A drone swarm launched for wildlife monitoring, stitched high-res shoreline mosaics that doubled as watch lists for new tire tracks to a covert fuel tank. Tasking orders moved like market orders. Pop the satellite now, catch the convoy at the headland, cue the cutter at the choke. Action slid from observation to leverage. A cable-laying barge paused off a headland after a week of quiet positioning. The next morning, a patrol appeared exactly where a cut would sting. Nobody said sabotage. Everyone spoke in plausibles: fishing gear snag, small quake, maintenance window. Finance desks in 2 cities saw a latency spike and missed a trade by milliseconds. It read like a glitch. It played like a warning. Impact rippled across ledgers and lives. Insurers rewrote riders. AIS docked north of a certain parallel meant exclusions, not excuses. Charter parties added escort compliance clauses with penalties calibrated to Moscow's schedules. Crews found extra lines in their safety briefings that sounded like euphemisms. Follow the lead ship, accept inspection, don't improvise. For fishers, familiar grounds grew crowded with steel and rules that changed with the wind. Parallel to that, coastal watchstanders learned a new rhythm. Radios crackled with drone reports, unknown quad over the gravel pad, repeat flights at dusk. A new boy sang a digital note at odd hours. Then a quiet visit, 2 officials with cards that didn't list titles, asking if anyone had seen a skiff tied at the West Cove after midnight. Routine, they said. It was routine because the game required it. Here's where it gets blunt. Enforcement arrived as a stack. Cutters to board, drones to see, satellites to track, submarines to map, and lawyers to bless the after action. None of it waited for boundaries to be blessed in New York. It moved on ice windows, convoy calendars, and the knowledge that in a place where help is far, the first ship on scene decides what lawful looks like. But there was one problem they couldn't clean up with presence. Every extra hull, every covert run, every cable cut risked the incident nobody could spin: a collision in the dark, a grounded tanker in a storm gap, a sensor web gone quiet in a real emergency. The choreography was tight, and winter doesn't applaud. Meanwhile, communities threaded the margins. A Coast Guard boarding brought food to a clinic one week and a fine to a cousin the next. A drone survey promised erosion grants and mapped a route to a private tank farm. A silent sub meant another flag claimed the seabed and maybe the future. Enforcement didn't just patrol the water, it rearranged who got to live from it. And with paperwork lagging, steel kept deciding. Ships wrote rules, sensors scored them, submarines underlined them. The map followed. Human collateral, villages on the front line of a balance sheet. The first bill arrived folded into a grocery flyer. Diesel went up 12%. Nobody argued with the math. The barge came later and burned more to make the window. A week after, a contractor's twin otter landed with prefab dorms stamped emergency. The village council signed a temporary lease. The keys went to a shift boss who wasn't from here. Stakes live in kitchens. In one house, a freezer hums with last fall's caribou, but the seal oil is low. The father took a harbor job tying lines for ice-class tugs. Steady pay, overtime, health coverage. He tells his son to keep the .223 clean, but be ready to work weekends when convoys stack. The boy nods. Hunting days slide around ship arrivals now, not seasons. A storm ate the road to the clinic. Permafrost slumped under last summer's heat, culvert twisted like taffy. The new VHF repeater chirped all day with traffic that didn't speak the local weather tongue. Medevac practice flights chopped the sky. When the real call came, the chopper was refueling for a convoy escort standby. The nurse improvised again. Here's what actually happened. Erosion chewed the point faster than elders remembered. Houses shifted on cribbing. A federal program offered relocation studies and 3 timelines: 5 years, 10 years, never. Contractors showed up to map bank edges with drones for resilience planning. Their first delivery next summer, barges with rebar and fuel bladders for a private tank farm upstream. Meanwhile, food webs rewired without warning. A lead that once opened by mid-April held a fragile skin into May. Bearded seals came later, thinner. The co-op freezer added store chicken at a discount on days. A survey crew bought everything else. Diesel kept the lights on, so nobody turned away the tankers. Every gallon that kept a classroom warm made the fishing grounds busier with steel. Consultation turned into a calendar. 4 meetings in 6 months, each with new faces and the same slide: jobs, mitigation, monitoring. Questions rose: who pays when the ice fails under the new pier? Which helicopters are for search and rescue versus crew change? The answers blurred into partnerships. People learned to spot the tell, promises tied to extraction timelines. If the project paused, the community investments went on ice too. Micro story: Lena, mid-30s, single mom, got hired as a dispatcher at the new resilience hub. The job meant steady income and a satellite phone that worked through storms. She logged ice pilot calls by day, homework by night, and set aside money for her mother's heating oil. One morning, she watched a line of Arc 7 hulls ghost past the flow edge. Months later, she learned the hunting ground her brother favored was inside the new safety exclusion. They argued in the kitchen. Neither was wrong. The argument didn't end, it just went quiet. Another, Peter, an elder with a stump for a thumb from a net winch 40 years back, stopped at the new fiber hut to ask the tech about weather cams. Soon, the tech said, pointing at a junction box. That same feed, when it went live, gave a distant desk real-time views of berths and barge heads. The village got a sharper horizon. A trader got a sharper ETA. Then came the contract no one saw until it was done, a relocation pilot for 6 homes along the worst stretch. The company handling the move also serviced the LNG berth 2 bays over. Billing codes separated community and commercial. The excavator didn't care. The same bucket pulled moorings at dawn and moved house pads at noon. Invoices flowed to different inboxes. The diesel came from one tank. Meanwhile, the local emergency committee ran the numbers. If a spill hit under ice, The window for action collapsed to hours of grey light and luck. They asked for booms rated for brash ice and skimmers that wouldn't choke. The boxes that arrived were made for summer. Best available, the contractor said, tapping a laminated manual. The elders passed the manual around like a bad joke. A school assembly turned into a micro course on drones. Kids learned to launch and land for shoreline monitoring. The drones saw more than the eyes on the bluff. Cracks in the ice, a new track to the fuel cache, a coyote nosing trash behind the responder dorm. A month later, the same drone model, different serial, buzzed a hunting party, low and rude. Complaints went nowhere. Not ours, someone said. Nobody believed it, everybody understood it. The balance sheet touched funerals too. A storm cut the power, the clinic generator held. The spare parts order was stuck because a convoy delay turned a 3-day ship into 11. Half the town went to the runway with shovels to clear drifts for a mercy flight. When the medevac came, its path crossed the convoy's corridor. ATC stacked everything, routine in a new routine that made grief wait its turn. 3 towns over, a community benefits agreement offered training stipends and a microloan fund for small businesses. Sign here. The fund helped a fisher buy a new engine and a freezer. It also signed the council into silence on litigation over the pier's impact zone. Standard clause, the lawyer said. That was the point. Here's where it gets blunt. A harbor job can pull a family out of debt. A closed lead can push them into a grocery bill they can't meet without that same job. Erosion contracts pay a road crew. The road serves a tanker queue. Consultation pays per diem. Relocation pays once, then keeps paying in absence. All of it tallies cleanly in somebody's model. None of it tallies the argument at Lena's table. 5 minutes in, the first truth lands. The rescue story sells because it's partly true. A medevac flies. A searchlight finds a skiff. A generator hums through a storm. But the line items that make those things possible double as scaffolding for extraction. That's not an accident. It's the design. And the origin of that design goes back further than any permit on the wall. The origin of the lie, 1970s, 2000s PR that bent the compass. To see how rescue became the password for extraction, go back to a different Cold War, the one that spiked prices and rewired plans. After the oil shocks in the 1970s, executives stared at maps where scarcity met ambition. The Arctic moved from myth to spreadsheet. Early seismic optimism painted big blobs under shallow seas. First drills met ice, storms, and engineering that wasn't ready. The dream outpaced the steel, but the dream stuck. Stakes were existential for energy states and companies. If you could prove a northern future, you could defend budgets and buy time. Investors needed a reason beyond luck. Politicians needed a story bigger than profit. That's when language started doing heavy lifting. Action took shape in the 1980s boardrooms and lab trailers. Seismic ships traced grids, and air photos became ice atlases. The first trials exposed a technical wall. Spill response under ice didn't work in practice. Skimmers choked, booms failed, fires didn't catch. The field notes were blunt. The press kits weren't. Teams rebranded setbacks as learnings and pivoted to the next thing, visibility as virtue. If you couldn't guarantee cleanups, you could guarantee presence. By the 1990s, environmental branding matured into a toolkit. Annual reports sprouted photos of caribou and rescue drills. Protection entered every paragraph. Partnerships with NGOs offered credibility. Marine mammal observers stood on decks while seismic guns thumped the seafloor. The hook was subtle. To protect, we must be there. Access braided with stewardship so tightly that arguing against one sounded like arguing against the other. Meanwhile, governments found the same melody. Coast Guard expansions, emergency caches, new weather stations, each budget line sold as safety. Dual use crept in behind it. A community fuel depot came bundled with a berthing dolphin set for ice glass beams. A wildlife research flight program doubled as reconnaissance. The lie wasn't that rescue was fake. It was that rescue was the point. It was the cover. Then the 2000s arrived with a new face for old ambitions. Icebreakers as heroes. Documentaries showed orange hulls shoving through flows, spotlighting science teams and medevac drills. In the B-roll were LNG berths and laid-on yards. Press briefings praised safety corridors. Quietly, routing permissions and fees took shape. The Northern Sea route narrative rolled out as global good, shorter, cleaner, efficient. The parts left off stage were sanctions, control, and tolls. Microstory, a public affairs officer drafted a speech about a new Arctic resilience hub. He crossed out staging for offshore support and wrote forward deployed search and rescue. He swapped throughput for preparedness. The blueprints stayed the same. The sentence did the work. Here's where it gets crazy, because one inconvenient detail refused to be managed. The spill they still couldn't clean. Trials in brash ice failed in labs and field pilots. Reports tucked that line near the end. Significant uncertainty remains under ice. PR pulled the same sentence to the top. We are investing to reduce uncertainty. The logic flipped risk into virtue without solving it. Meanwhile, China rolled out the Polar Silk Road language: cooperation, sustainability, shared opportunity, while backing Yamal LNG and tying offtake to steel. Russia embraced it. The phrase softened hard infrastructure. In Washington and Ottawa, aging icebreakers were framed as safety deficits, not market leverage gaps. Proposals for new hulls wore SAR uniforms, while their specs read like escort catalogs. Impact landed in public memory as a blur. People learned to see hangars and piers as rescue first, industry second. Every photo op of a helicopter winch overwrote the hose diameters below. Media adopted the frame because it looked like balance, protect, and prosper. The compass bent a few degrees each year until north meant access. There was one problem the narrative never paid for: communities weren't props. Elders kept asking about under-ice spills and late ice on hunting grounds. Answers circled back to commitments, partnerships, future tech. The truth was simple and stayed unsolved. The story kept moving anyway. So by the time the first modern deals whispered through spreadsheets, the vocabulary was waiting. Safety opened doors. Infrastructure walked through. Extraction took the keys. The bills, as always, went to the people already living on the shoreline. Catastrophe pricing in a frozen sea. Under-ice response has a clock with no mercy. In shoulder season, you might get daylight, open leads, and air gaps for burning. In polar night, you get none of that. No booms that hold under brash ice, no skimmers that won't choke, no dispersants that stay where you put them. Oil threads under a lid and moves with currents, no model pins down. By the time the wind shifts, your window of action has shut like a trap. Stakes are measured in hours and lives. A crewman with frostbitten hands can wait a day for a hello when the ceiling's low. A slick under new ice can't. A village that drinks from a river under snow won't know the taste has changed until it's in the kettle. Fisheries don't get insurance for a lost season when larvae die under a pane of black glass. That's the ledger nobody shows on Investor Day. Here's what actually happened in drills and near misses. Teams laid booms into grease ice. The skirts rode up and froze. Skimmers grabbed slush that clogged strainers faster than pumps could breathe. In situ burns lit only when the ice spread thinned, which is exactly when the slick spread wider. Helicopters flew daylight-only sorties with buckets that swung in crosswinds and hit everything but the target. In one winter trial, responders logged partial success because a patch of diesel stained the snow blue where they could photograph it. Under the lid, the rest kept moving. Meanwhile, liability math fenced off the worst case. Caps existed, numbers that looked big until you priced a blowout under a sunless sky, with escorts grounded and cutters iced in. Captive insurers, entities owned by the same companies they covered, held the first layer. Reinsurers took the next slice, then paused at policy fine print that excluded under-ice operations and acts of government that looked a lot like convoy delays. Externalities, the polite word for your grief, flowed off balance sheets into public budgets and family savings. Then planners ran the black swan, not a deepwater well, but a grounded LNG carrier wedged into a storm gap, bow in rubble ice, stern in swell. The scenario read like fiction until it didn't. Tugs tried to snub the ship's drift. Hawsers snapped like banjo strings in the cold. The cargo wasn't oil, it was gas chilled to a liquid that flashes and evaporates fast, but the bunker fuel in the belly would bleed heavy and slow. Containment. Booms can't stand upright in brash and frasil. Waves shove ice like sore teeth. A fracture on the starboard side, a ripped cofferdam, and now you're spraying fuel into jigsaw ice while the wind shifts 30 degrees at dawn. Unknown to them, across a continent, a trading desk saw spreads blow out. Freight-rated Arctic compliance spiked as convoys stacked. Energy indexes twitched as LNG schedules slipped past terminals that can't take surprise. A sovereign fund with exposure to Arctic infrastructure felt two lines dip: pipeline JV equity and a passive index basket that forgot to look under the hood. Fisheries futures in a C2 straits away widened on rumors alone. The contagion map drew itself. Hull stuck, route shut, premiums up, cargoes late, processors idle, paychecks thin, then budgets in parliaments wobbling because revenue arrived in November, not September. Insurers called it tail risk, then tried to price it into riders nobody could afford. A clause popped up: exclusion, response activities under consolidated ice during periods of darkness. That's half the year north of a line locals don't need a GPS to find. Another, sanctions-related delays not covered. Translation: if the icebreaker that frees your ship can't escort you for policy reasons, your waiting time belongs to you. Catastrophe got coded as timing and compliance, not weather and physics. Action on the water turned desperate. A crew cut a hole in new ice beside the hull to drop a skim ahead. The pit froze back in minutes. A tug tried to push brash aside to make a burn pool. The pool closed like a zipper. A helicopter dropped sorbent rolls onto a patch that moved under the crew's boots. The captain stood on the bridge with a radio that stayed polite while his timeline didn't. Engineers did math in breath fog: heat loss from LNG tanks, stress in a pitching hull, the crawl of a leak you can't see through black ice and dusk. Impact didn't wait for a press release. Coastal freezers stocked with seal and char went empty faster because boats couldn't launch through shattered pans. A clinic asked for more inhalers after fumes rode into town low and mean. Schools shut for 2 days while responders staged gear in the gym with banners still hanging from a talent show. In the city far south, a minister called it contained, which was technically true if you drew a boundary around the entire bay. Then the markets did what they always do with risk they can't map. They moved away from it or demanded rent. Rates for Arc 7 charters jumped. Conventional hulls avoided the window. Cargo owners wrote to boards about diversification of routes that looked a lot like Suez again for another year. A banker asked the wrong question on a call: what's the worst case under ice? And learned there isn't a model, only anecdotes. Meanwhile, executives looked for hedges. Minerals don't spill like oil, they leak slowly through permits. If disaster is priced in for hydrocarbons, you pivot where the catastrophe timeline is longer and the optics cleaner. Nickel lifts and ESG slide better than bunker fuel in brash ice. Offtake prepayments cushion shocks. The ledger tilts. There was one problem none of that solved. The technology deck still ends with the same sentence it held in the 1980s: significant uncertainty remains under ice. Translation: they can't clean the worst spill in the conditions most likely to hide it. The premiums will rise, the riders will thicken, the language will soften, the physics won't. Greenland's choice: debt, rare earths, and a superpower bidding war. Greenland felt like a quiet room with 3 phones ringing. On one line, a company offered jobs, roads, and checks with commas. On another, diplomats promised grants, defense ties, and science partnerships. The third line carried a different pitch: offtake agreements that start gentle and end with leverage. Under the ice cap, the rock didn't care who called. On the coast, every call had a cost. Stakes were personal and geopolitical at once. Kvainfjeld, Quanasut to locals, sat like a loaded phrase. In the ore was one of the world's largest rare earth deposits tied to uranium. Magnets for turbines and EVs live in that rock, so does a byproduct that scares people for good reasons. Sheng Resources held a significant stake in the company aiming to dig. That meant any shovel would cast a long shadow into Chinese downstream control. For Copenhagen and Washington, it set off alarms. For Nuuk, it set off a debate about who gets to say no. Here's what actually happened. Campaign signs went up in 2021 with mining at the center. At rallies, one side held up job numbers and promised training. The other held up a glass of water and asked who'd drink it if the tailings pond leaked. Ballots landed where speeches couldn't. Voters turned down the project the only way that counted, by electing a government that would halt key permits. For a week, the world met Greenland in headlines. Then the news cycle moved on. The pressure didn't. Unknown to them, across desks in Beijing, Copenhagen, and Washington, memos shifted tone. Grants and soft loans got bundled with capacity building. Military planners eyed airfield upgrades as dual-use assets, runways long enough for heavy lift, search and rescue on the brochure, logistics in the footnotes. In one pitched deck, a radar site proposed as weather monitoring sat on a ridge perfect for watching the Giuk Gap revive in a new century. The map of oars overlapped the map of flight lines. Meanwhile, term sheets thickened around words that sound harmless until they don't. Offtake, prepayment, stabilization clause. An offtake locks where your oar goes. A prepayment means the buyer funds you before you mine, then holds the collateral in rock under your feet. Stabilization freezes the rules, so new environmental laws can't change the deal you signed when you were under budget pressure. Debt creeps in through those doors. Sovereignty feels it when choices narrow. Microstory, Ain, a young geologist from Ilulissat, took a job logging cores. She loved the work, thin sections under scope that glowed like galaxies. Her father hated the idea of uranium in any form near the fjord. At dinner, she explained decay chains and tailings liners. He explained a wind that blew in spring and how it carried dust to the drying racks. They didn't convince each other. The next morning, she went back to the lab. He went to a council meeting. Another, a civil servant in Nuuk, got a draft agreement from a foreign ministry. It offered funding for harbor improvements labeled as resilience. He read the annexes twice. In the index was a clause about priority docking for certain flag vessels during exercises and emergencies. He put the file in a drawer and called a colleague. "We need a second opinion." The colleague called a cousin who'd been at Kangerlussuaq when a runway extension, for safety, landed cargo that looked a lot like parts for something nobody would name. Here's where the tug-of-war tightened. The US courted with offers to finance airports and mineral mapping, framing it as reducing dependence on strategic rivals. Denmark tried to balance, mindful that home rule isn't a slogan, it's law. China's approach ran through corporates and research labs, showing up in JV proposals and scholarships that trained the next generation of Arctic engineers. Everyone said sustainability. Everyone wanted the ore. Local politics set tripwires no one offshore fully respected. The referendum spirit didn't vanish after the election. Villages weighed tailings against caribou roots, radiation against rare earths, money now against autonomy later. A promise of 200 jobs landed in a town where 40 felt huge. A pledge to monitor dust didn't reassure a family living downwind.